an introduction, a kind of proper testimonial. And I'm not sure that some of you really understand what a real testimonial should be like. If you want to see what a proper testimonial is, I invite you sometime to go to Echo Park, to Amy Semple McPherson's Great Angelus Temple. Amy Semple McPherson was the most famous woman evangelist in U.S. history in the 1920s. And her Angelus Temple still stands. And if you go up in the mezzanine, they have this huge glass display case. And it's a real proper testimonial to Sister Amy, because it consists of all these crutches and plaster casts and blind people's eyeglasses and wheelchairs. And next to each of them, there's a little hand-scrawled note saying, "Hallelujah. Sister Amy lifted the scales from my eyes, I can see." Or, you know, "God bless Sister Amy, I can walk again." So in this fashion, I want to, relate my own testimonial to Mario, which is a kind of confession that each morning I get up in a cold sweat with a great sense of dread, knowing that I'm going to have to face LA again, and in all probability, see LA in exactly the same kind of way I've been seeing LA for the last year or two, or 35 or 50 years, or however long it's been. And when you're staring at a city, when you've been looking at the face of the city, this city as long as I have, and trying to write about it, you inevitably get imprisoned in your own cliches, your own rhetoric. And nothing becomes more difficult than finding some new way, some fresh way to see the city. As Mario might put it, it's hard to see the city for the grid. And I've been looking at the grid for so long that I began to see nothing else. And then I looked at his book, The Urban Text, and suddenly, hallelujah, begin to understand that there are entirely different ways in which to make sense of Los Angeles and to see LA. And I think perhaps if there's anything that this book, which is just one of Mario's accomplishments, but undoubtedly the one most of us are familiar with, if it's done anything at all, it's begun to convince me that there are spatialities that exert enormous influence on our existences, on our sensibilities, on our itineraries, maybe even in the kind of structure of emotions through which we live in the city. But these spatialities we're scarcely aware of at all. And these spatialities, I think, in Mario's analysis are kind of two kinds. One are the absences in the city. And kind of following Freud, I guess Mario would say these absences are never just absences. They're never just accidents. They're always symptomatic. And for me, what these absences are all the history that's never been made, all the history that was intended for Los Angeles but never really happened. All the great boulevards that stop abruptly, all the little utopias that somehow never made it to the future. As a friend of mine, David Reed, has put it more eloquently, LA is a kind of Burgess shale of cities. It's crowded with all kinds of futures that haven't happened. And to understand the city, you have to be able to begin to understand and see these absences. But at the same time, it's full of all kinds of presences, too. Presences which the urban text is, I think, helping a lot of us to see better. Again, in the forms of accidents, interruptions, inexplicable accidents in the otherwise, total kind of almost totalitarian, logic of the grid. And Mario makes us understand that, again, these accidents are symptomatic. One of his commentators in urban text, Joan Kopchak, says hallelujah too, because for her, what all this is saying is that the city has an unconscious, and we really can't understand the city or pretend to intervene in the city until we recognize that so much of our activity in the city is molded by this urban unconscious. I have kind of my own cause in all this and would say that yes, that's true. the people who are the kind of psychoanalysts of the city are people called historians. And particularly in Los Angeles, with the kind of reading of the city that Mario suggests must lead us to is not so much back to the psychoanalytic couch, but back to the very kind of difficult, complex history of this city. But anyway, that's my kind of testimonial. Reading Mario's work has lifted the scales from my eyes and made it a little easier to get up in the morning and face the same old city. And it's a great pleasure to introduce one of the most imaginative and provocative architects in the United States, Mario.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to talk about a number of things. Actually, I might be not a totally structured presentation. I'm going to show a number of urban drawings that I've been producing in the last 8 years, 9 years. I'm going to show a house that we've almost completed. I'm going to show you very bad photographs that I took myself. I'm going to show you a urban project that we've been developing for the last 2 years for the city of Des Moines in Iowa. And I'm also going to show very briefly 2 more urban projects. In a way, this lecture is going to be referring to a book that it's now finally in print and hopefully be finished by the end of summer or beginning of the fall. A book that should have been finished a long time ago, but I never could finish, on the American city. It's the book on New York and Los Angeles. And yeah. And if there is a general subject for this conversation, is the architect's desire for the city, or in other terms, the city as an object of the architect's desire, or perhaps the urban text as the object of desire. Because in the end we're going to be talking about reading, and reading is usually about a text. So I'm not going to talk about the real city, the objective city, the city we live, we inhabit. I'm going to talk about a number of fictional cities that somehow in an oblique way relate to that literal city. I'm also going to talk not just about one city, but about a number of cities. I'd like to discuss the European city, the modernist city, and the American city. And I would like to also talk about architects whose desire, apparent object of desire, was the modernist city, but in fact the object of desire, according to me, was the American city, repressed and transformed into something else which we know as the modernist city. So anyway, we're going to be talking about all these strange relationships between different architects, artists, and cities. Architects, actually, just one, Le Corbusier, the architect who first wrote a book about the contemporary city. And I also like to talk about another Frenchman, a Frenchman who decided that Paris was not really the place to be at the turn of the century, despite the fact that everybody and everything seemed to be happening in Paris. Instead, he came to New York, and he spent most of his life in America, and that's Marcel Duchamp. So, so I want to talk about Corbu and Marcel, and I want to talk about all those cities, and obviously, in the end, I'm talking about myself. And I would say in the end, I'm talking about a constant dialogue between Diana and me. So somehow she's not here, but she will be here. I'll close this with a project she designed last year. So let's start with the first two slides, since this is a lecture in a school of architecture, and you probably want to see images. So I always start my lectures, no matter what I'm talking about, with the same two slides, which are these two slides. It's like, you know, I always read the same book. And I always start my lectures with these two slides because, in a way, these slides represent a question around which our work has been revolving for the last 15 years. On the left, Camilo Cité seen through Hegemann's American Vitruvius. So there we have already a migration of ideas from Europe about the European city to America through a German urbanist who decided to come here and who changed Camilo Cité's book, added chapters in order to rethink Camilo Cité in relationship or vis-a-vis the American context. On the right-hand side, a paradigmatic example of modernist urbanism, the formula. The contemporary city versus the old fabric of Paris, cancer, as Le Corbusier called it. Next. Now, what we saw in those two slides could be also be called with two names. The city as fabric, the old classical European city as a dense, continuous fabric and an extruded plan, versus the contemporary city, a city of objects on a field, floating or that just landed on an infinite plane. Also, strangely enough, extruded. Now, we're looking here at a different Le Corbusier, because actually, when one talks about Le Corbusier, one should refer to a number of Le Corbusier architects and to a number of Le Corbusier urbanists. And I'm talking about Le Corbusier, the urbanist number 2 of Radiant City, not the architect of the city of tomorrow, which is the one we saw before. And on the left, we see a diagram, one of the beautiful sketches we find in that book, with 3 lines. The first one called reason, the second one, passion, the third one, life. And on the right-hand side, this is not something that Corbu proposes. That is, I took 2 different images from the book, juxtaposed them, and I find this interesting relationship between contemporary city, reason, and a skyline of an American city, and the second line called passion, which is confirmed many times by the way this city, this American city, appears and reappears in Le Corbusier's work, written work, since his the architectural book, first urbanistic book, the Radiant City, and finally in when the cathedrals were white. Now, he always refers to the American city as the expression of adolescent passion, as violent, as ugly and beautiful. He says in the cathedrals were white, I hate it 100 times, but I love it 50 times. So this hate-love relationship is definitely a very neurotic relationship entertained between this city, which he finds ugly, and at the same time, he feels attracted to it. And we don't need a couch to see that there is a very strange relationship between Corbu and the American city, this love, what he calls this love-hate relationship. The city that's hated, but as I'm saying, always reappears, constantly appears together with a number of his own of projects of Le Corbusier himself, as that negative element that has only the power of its energy. But it's all wrong from an architectural point of view. Now, I also want to point out this panel divided in two with the contemporary city on top and the American city on the bottom. And even if I'm not going to show the large glass, I want you to remember this division into the female, male, and some kind of transformation in Duchamp's large glass. And we'll find that actually there is some of that happening in this diagram, in this collage. The collage of a drawing and a photograph. Next. Obviously for Europe, a grid was an image. A grid belongs to the imaginary and not to the real. In order to produce a straight street, Rome had to cut through the brain-like formation of its plan Via Julia in the Renaissance. Now, when the Romans cut that street, the first straight street in Europe, in America, all the cities were planned like that. And that's why when we think about the American city, we perhaps should think of those Europeans who came here with very specific ideas about how to lay out cities. And the cities were laid out according to Vitruvius, to Alberti. The Spanish came with the law of Indies, which prescribed grids. They came with plans, and it was very easy to start from scratch with a plan, with a drawing, as opposed to the cities of Europe that started with buildings. That's why I call that figure on the right, and perhaps the American city, the expression of Europe's desire. So we're talking about desire again, but now about a different type of desire. Let's see the next. Next slide. And now, since we're talking about desire, I want to talk about the peephole on the left-hand side, étant donné, given. This is Duchamp's peephole, and which is obviously about the gaze, which is obviously about an eye, and that's all you can fit. It's also about the paralysis of the body. The body cannot move because if we move, we don't see anymore. And what do we see? We'll see in a minute. Now, on the right-hand side, another sketch by Le Corbusier. And the sketch by Le Corbusier, it's not that different from the idea of the I, the real, and the representational mechanisms that were in place since Renaissance. And somehow it's important to understand that Corbusier's fixation in what it's called the scopic, that is the visual, and he talks about the eyes that do not see, and will actually see that the one who doesn't see is Corbu himself. And what he doesn't see is that he is that eye, and not the eye proposed by Duchamp on the left. And what he can't see is what he most desires, which is the American city. So let's see the next. And this is what we see. What we see actually is not that simple. What we see questions the subject that is seeing. Because the subject that is represented by Corbu's eye, and that's not that far from Dürer's self looking into the same hole, but now covered with a dress. But look at the position of those two bodies. It's the Eurocentric, phallocentric, etc. And you can keep going with those adjectives. Described by the right-hand side, while in fact this mannequin that we see on the left-hand side was worked on for years by Duchamp, as both Lyotard and Octavio Paz, and I really never knew who said that before, described this body as half male, half female, because actually if you take it, cut it in half, the left-hand side has a male pectoral, the right-hand side, the right-hand side, the male pectoral, the left-hand side, the female breast, and the sex, it's not that clear, actually. So then we have a gaze, male or female, that is looking at a body that is both male and female. It's Duchamp, but it's Marcel, but it's also Rose, C'est la vie. And this interrogation and the perhaps major question, which is that if the apparatus of perspective represented there is definitely hidden, the machinery that is produced this image is totally hidden. I also want you to take a look at the arm, the hand supporting the illuminating gas, because we're going to see something that perhaps will remind us of this hand. Next slide. The machine behind the landscape, the scene that we just seen before. And as we know, Duchamp doesn't explain this work. He just gives us instructions for disassembling and assembling. That's all. There is no more stories. There is no more narrative. There is no more text. While in fact we know that there is a lot of text in Duchamp. And it's not just about the visual. The next. And now guess whose arm on the left-hand side, but instead of the illuminating glass, we have the element that somehow allows for the displacement that goes from the bottom to the top, and which somehow makes it possible for Corbu replace and suppress the American city and transform it into the contemporary city. Geometry, abstraction, purity, rationality, reason. The next. So now we finished the first part, this opaque introduction, and I'm going to show you some drawings of different cities that show that somehow they do not correspond, they do not relate at all to the descriptions given by Corbusier. They also show that they, in their symptoms, in their lapses, in their breaks, in their discontinuities, they're talking about a logic that is very different from the logic of the plan of the European city. They're talking both in their spaces, in their buildings, in their behavior of their buildings, about a very different way of doing cities, of producing cities. So this is what Corbusier saw as a grid, and he describes Manhattan as a grid, 200 streets. It's not exactly what I would call a grid. Obviously, this is the historical southern tip of Manhattan on the left-hand side, exploded, and then on the right-hand side, we see represented the streets or the voids as the actors of this drawing. And we start to see things that we obviously don't see in the plan just with this very simple type of representation. Classical figure ground. Next. When we get to be more fictional about the way we represent things, we perceive that there are ways of accounting for distortions. For instance, pressure between two grids, overlappings between grids, and that's why we get, perhaps, why we get the square blocks in the village, the Soho grid intersecting the gridiron. The next. A strange situation where the fabric transforms itself into building objects. And that became one of the most interesting themes in our work, because the big question for us was, does this fabric object thesis of Le Corbusier presented by his Ville contemporain, is that an explanatory formula for the American city? And we're saying it's not that simple. And we actually played both, I played in my drawings and also in our projects with a variety of possibilities, collapsing fabric into objects and thinking of objects as fabric and fabric as object. And I want to talk about that for a minute. I always had the feeling that buildings in America resist the idea of forming fabric. That buildings in America actually want to be by themselves. That they have a relationship of repulsion and not necessarily of attraction. And that they're somehow, at a certain point of history, compressed or forced to form fabric despite themselves. Perhaps the fabric in America is only a glitch in the history of the American city, which started by being discontinuous, and it's going back to being discontinuous. And that's why I prefer to talk about not just objects on a field and fabric as a formula for describing the city, but also of these buildings that behave as objects and are forced to form fabric, or as in this case, which you can see this straight vertical line, that's Broadway, and the triangle is the big space in lower Manhattan where that, let me see, I think I have this. Yeah. See this building? This is the McKimmid and White Municipal Building. Now, these three streets, 1, 2, 3, actually can be seen as elements of fabric that come from the west, which is this side, towards the east, which is this side, and go through the wall of Broadway and then become objects, that is, pieces of the city that float in this triangular podium, which is also represented on the right-hand side by extruding the streets, not just arbitrarily, but in terms of two possible readings. One, speed, that is, the faster, the taller, but which also corresponds to the question of the FAR and the building code. That's why I want to think of these three-dimensional drawings as the superego, that which is imposed by the building code, and which somehow the buildings, the developers, everybody will try to beat. The next slides. And these very strange representations show how, when applied this technique, buildings that work as objects on a field, like the projects on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, representing the void as a solid with a 5-story datum, which is the datum of the townhouse in New York, acquire this very strange configuration. See the next. We're now closer. Okay, this is, you know what this is. Okay, Los Angeles on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Now, for me, drawing Los Angeles was a major revelation, because actually I always knew about the 1 mile grid, but I never experienced it, both in reality, driving and drawing it. And drawing it together with the 19th century, 20th century, early 20th century grid. And for me, the revelation was that I finally found something that was uniquely American, because you couldn't find a 1 mile grid in Europe. It does not exist. Now, it's not only that. The other revelation is this revelation that this grid was also proposed at the same time that democracy was proposed. That is, this is the Second Continental Congress. And this colossal grid, because that's the scale, that is, it's something that cannot be measured. It's beyond measurement, especially if you walk. Opened my eyes. And that's when I frantically started to draw it in different ways, just for the sheer pleasure of contrasting the scale, the colossal scale, with the scale of the known pedestrian grid. Also, what I really enjoyed was the idea of drawing Los Angeles without the freeway, because everybody had the feeling that, you know, the first thing that one should draw in Los Angeles are the freeways. That's the local monument. And I decided, and that's always the way I work, not to go with the obvious. And I decided that Los Angeles actually was not about the freeways, because, you know, it's the superficial, perceptual sign of LA. And the deep sign of LA I still find at this level. And then it was confirmed when, you know, after coming back a number of times, people would tell me, never get into the freeways at 4 or 5, avoid 4 or 5 at rush hour. It's totally stupid. Just go on the 1 mile grid and you'll go faster. So I think that there is something in it that somehow it's still there, and it still gives us, perhaps for the first time, the dimension of the megalopolis. Next. Now, what I also enjoyed is the idea of these very different cities. Cities somehow linked with this magma, which is this 1 mile grid, and the veins or the arteries of the boulevard weaving the cities, going with and against the grids of the cities. And you can recognize on the right-hand side Wilshire Boulevard knitting together a number of cities and places. Now, the next set of drawings start to talk about fragments of typological fictions. That is, for instance, Wilshire going through 4-5, or the morphology of Beverly Hills on the right-hand side the next. But even more interesting than that, these two sections of Wilshire Boulevard were the high-rise canyon, this high-rise corridor, which for me it's the only interesting thing that happened in the history of a skyscraper besides Manhattan, which is early 20th century, and this is mid-20th century, and then everybody's been doing boring Manhattans in their cities. This is perhaps the only other alternative, which is this linear Sorian-Mata type city that cuts like with a knife through the through this fabric, through the tissue of Los Angeles. And the new situations, the voids creating by the parking lots that are needed by these these high-rise buildings, which for me start to talk about a totally new landscape, the sea of cars and asphalt with these big buildings, and the new walls separating the two districts of houses, which are basically represented with those flat pancakes on the upper and lower level of the drawing. And then on the right-hand side, the idea, which is actually occurred to me just by because of the certain way in which buildings behaved on two different grids. On one side, the buildings seem to respect or be attracted to the boulevard. On the other side, they just decide to do their own game and play that random, chaotic play. And that's what this drawing is suggesting. Now, what you can see is that there is a very fine line in these drawings, and I would say they are on the other side of the line of what one could call description. That is, they start to invent what they see. Next. And that's why I call these drawings readings, because these cities I'm describing do not exist. I mean, I'm writing them when I'm reading them. This is Boston, and just a few drawings to show the difference between the head and the neck. And it's very important, actually. It took me a while to understand Boston, and I needed these two concepts. That is, I couldn't understand this radioconcentric fabric type city until I discovered that the head was very different from the neck, which behaved like we've seen Manhattan and Los Angeles before, while the head, made out of old-style fabric and objects in the field, produced this alternation of large-scale districts and voids, like an A, B, A, B, A, B, A structure, as opposed to the grids on the neck that somehow reflected a radioconcentric tendency, which is what you could see in the next drawings. Next. For instance, the forces of attraction of the different radial streets towards the center, City Hall, on the right-hand side, and the triangulation of the head, which is pretty obvious. That is, if you want to produce something circular with two-dimensional cardboard, you need to cut triangles in order to bend. And that's basically what the grids do. That is, they produce triangular situations, and Boston is full of them. Next. Or New Haven, which is another very interesting situation of radioconcentric plans, but having as a core a pure 9-square grid. So we see the fabric-like versus object-like structure of New Haven, and the core on the right-hand side surrounded by walls, which are not real walls. The walls are produced by something that is also very specific to the American city plan. You see, a grid presupposes that, an ideal grid presupposes that we can circulate forever. That is, there is never a wall at the end of the street. Actually, Le Corbusier thought that that was very good. He said, it's like our digestive system. We don't have a church or a palace blocking the orifices of our bodies. So in a way, the ideal grid behaves like that. That is, it goes on forever. But that's not the case. That is, once you analyze a few cities, you realize that there are always problems with those fluid grids, and there are always T-intersections, walls, implied or real, that somehow mark an end to the street. Obviously, we don't find the opera at the end of these streets. And now, these walls are basically indicating the places where streets hit a wall, or where street dead ends. Next. This becomes a lot more interesting in a few drawings I'm going to show about Chicago that are also in the book that Mike mentioned before. This is another very interesting idea of how to structure a city. This is again New Haven, and this is Chapel Street, one of the most important streets in New Haven. And what these drawings are doing is splitting the perfect grid on the right-hand side and everything else, the leftovers, on the left-hand side. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, you see that it's almost a catalog of different textures, of different grids and different types of buildings, and then the chaotic elements that somehow knit together the perfect grid. So we have a sequence and perhaps a party for designing a city in these two types of drawings. And I would say there is probably a party for a city in every one of the drawings I've been showing. Next. Chicago. My tendency is to look for regularity when things appear irregular, and to look for irregularities when things appear regular. That is, it's, you know, the old psychoanalytic trick. Is you listen to what's supposedly normal and wait for an anomaly, for some kind of strange lapses. Now, Chicago is your 1 mile grid city. So the first thing I looked is into everything that went against the 1 mile grid. And one of those things were the diagonals. And there are many different diagonals in Chicago. They're all old Indian trails. And this is perhaps one of the places in the plan of Chicago. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 4 by 8 square mile grid section of Chicago. Now you can see what happens with the directionality of the streets because of the cutting through the incisions produced by these diagonals. And you can see also what happens with the blocks next to those diagonals that somehow also generate their own fabric. They're like scars through the body of the city. Next. Or, for instance, in this case, topography. The image is that Chicago is totally flat. But if you look at a topographic map, you see this. And there is, in the center, a shape in the lower part. I'm using my finger instead of this. But you see this? We called it the whale, which is this now amplified on the right-hand side. And you can see what this whale is doing to the 1 mile grid. Next. Another look at Chicago. This is about the T intersections. And these are the north-south, what I call the north-south invisible walls. Next. And these are the east-west invisible walls. That is, the points where streets break, which are not necessarily the points where the break occurs because of the Chicago River, which you can see somehow drawn in black, I would say, through the streets. Now, let's see the next slides. When you overlap the two sets of invisible walls, what we see is a number of walls that are quite continuous or that create some sort of a precinct. Like, for instance, these precincts here, which happen to be the so-called projects in Chicago. And actually, when Stanley Tigerman saw this drawing, he said, this is the line that divides white Chicago from black Chicago. So what this drawing is telling us is that what seemed to be just purely formal and syntactic and perhaps not carrying any meanings or maybe just architectural meanings are perhaps the foundations or the basis on which we project or we can potentially project other meanings. Like, for instance, separations of race, class, etc. Next. Now, these two drawings talk about something else. Fabric, this is the loop. And the drawing on the left-hand side is talking about the old fabric, the 19th century fabric of the foundation plan of Chicago. And those red lines, which actually I drew without knowing what they were, I never really look into history, I must confess. I just look into the plan. And then once I understand the plan, I go back to history and try to find significance in what I find. And otherwise, the problem I have with history is that it's too long and there are too many facts. And you never know which ones are pertinent or not, at least from my point of view, which is a very biased point of view. So this actually was interesting because I found those strange directional streets that somehow related to the railroad and the point where the railroad stopped. And that's marked in the structure of the streets of Chicago. Now, on the right-hand side, I drew all the famous buildings in the loop, all the buildings, objects, that somehow also managed to clear part of they're so powerful that they managed to destroy part of the fabric in order to exhibit themselves. Mises Building, the Helmut Jahn, the Monadnock Building. I'm saying buildings going from the Chicago frame period to the 80s. What's interesting is that we're looking at the same place, but we're looking at two different cities. The 19th century fabric city and the 20th century, late 20th century city, and the two of them are occupying the same physical place. And that gives us another way of looking at the city as a number of strata that coexist, or they're spatially occupying the same room, the same space. Next. And now back to Marcel. Because actually, I want to talk about myself and about the way in which these plans had been seen in order to be redrawn in the way I presented them. And also because our own work relates to a number of operations, the ready-made, the criticism of the visual, the presence of the text, the place of the randomness and chaos in the work that somehow all these works represent. For instance, turning upside down, putting out of context, letting gravity design a shape. Next. putting together two objects that do not belong together, that come from different realms. And the one on the right-hand side, that fresh widow, perhaps as important in our work as the door of the étant donné of given. Fresh widow, which is this French window where the panes of glass have been replaced with black leather. Now, very difficult to see through this window. Let's see the next. And I want to show you some of our projects. The first one consisted of moving this house. Moving a house and placing it the wrong way. That is, the back is looking to the street. Also, an urban house, a townhouse, is now placed in a condition that makes it into a farmhouse. And a few moves have been done. The new balcony that somehow tells you that that's not the entrance, although you enter that way, and that's the kitchen, which is actually the way you usually enter in America, through into a house. Anyway, the next. A townhouse which is actually sandwiched between this neo-Gothic church and Philip Johnson's Asia House, which acts as a hinge. And the question of hinge is something that always interested us. And it's a townhouse, except that when you look at the plans, they're upside down. That is, the piano nobile is on the top floor. The big window, therefore, it's not on the second floor. And the plan itself, which I'm not going to show, goes through a series of transformations that move and put together different types into this, which is supposed to be a townhouse. The next. A restaurant in Soho. A parking garage where we just added the window. Obviously, the interior was important. We also added some graffiti. The next one. On the left-hand side, a pantry door, which is made out of a steel curved door mounted on a library library ladder truck or hardware, and the handle comes from a industrial refrigerator. So I would say all the components or the pieces do not really belong to the, I mean, they're all, I would say, displaced from some other context. On the right-hand side, a cone sink. That is an object that condensates two different objects. These are basic operations that we'll see throughout the work. The next. I'm going to show you very briefly a house that we designed 3 years ago, 3 years ago, and it's just getting finished. The floor plan on the left-hand side is the first floor. The floor plan on the right-hand side is second floor. As you can see, the house is basic. It's from a compositional point of view. It's based on a grid of spaces that is 15 feet wide and that intersects in 6 places that become towers, which are quite clear on the right-hand side. What the left-hand side picture tells you, or plan tells you, is that the towers, at least 3 of the towers, are on stilts. And actually what happened is that those towers are all, and the grid itself of movement throughout the house has been lifted to a second floor, with the exception of the square tower on the right-hand side, okay, which is, does this work? Yeah, this one, okay. Yeah. I guess no more battery. Anyway, you enter, yeah, there. You enter here, okay? Somewhere in between the round and the square. And there is a wall that somehow marks the space of entry. There is a shed, you can see that 120-foot long shed, which is divided in all the public spaces on the ground floor. When you enter, there is a strange elliptical staircase, elliptical circular staircase on the left-hand side, a perspectivated staircase on the right-hand side that take you to the second floor bridges, that is the bedrooms on the second floor. And on the long bar going from left to right, there is a sunroom, library, a living room, a dining room, a pantry, and a kitchen. And next. Then on the, okay. The site on the left-hand side, 8-acre site on a pond in Southampton. And on the right-hand side, one of the earlier versions, but quite close to the final form of the house. As you can see, every one of the towers acquires a different configuration. We want to think of them as found objects, in the sense that we found them in books, not in reality. That is, there are different types of construction, standard construction pieces for different farming buildings that you find in the east end of Long Island. For instance, the cube on a tripod, which you'll see, is the basic structure for a windmill, etc. Let's see the next. The plane, that it's almost like a different project of a very different scale. But somehow it's also an index to tell you what's going on in the house. You can see the house here from a site adjacent to it, this potato field, and from the water side on the right-hand side. Next. Okay, again, from the potato field now in flower, and this is actually a earlier picture, still during construction. Okay, let's see the next. This is a more recent picture. On the right-hand side, the garage, which is a berm, it's buried. And which you can see also on the left-hand side, and the view of the front of the house, which is totally enclosed except the coil-type building, the circular building on the left-hand side. The next. Okay, the pool house and a view of the house from the pool house. The next. Two of the structures on the front, the housekeeper's house, which is the one on the right-hand side, which is actually the only tower that was left as the datum for all the other towers. The passage, or that link between the tower, the housekeeper tower, and this other space, which is basically a media room, which is buried, and a bedroom on top, that horizontal passage is all storage for the art. This is a house for an art collector. Next. And the library, I mean, this was supposed to be a greenhouse, but then our client got married, and his wife decided that she needed more rooms. So we decided to divide the greenhouse into a library, although they don't read. But we thought that perhaps they could have, for instance, trade magazines or something of that kind to balance the video room, which is the one you see on the right-hand side. And anyway, you can see the entry door here. Next. The entry space into the house. Obviously, the partie is such that the house is made out of rooms, but there are cracks between the rooms that are very unstable, and you can see what happens. That is, if you are inside one of those cracks, then when you get into the room, things calm down again. So it's basically a very neurotic house in the sense that you go from extreme anxiety to total relaxation. Next. One of the views of that long shed, you can see that it's, it's still not totally finished. A view from the back of that strange curved staircase going up to the master room wing. Next. And one of the stable rooms. Now, what's interesting is that the house is a very voyeuristic house because of the partie and because of the way windows have been distributed. Every room looks at all the other rooms. So it's basically all about a house where everything the house where every room looks at the other rooms in the house. And obviously other structures in the landscape. Next. And these are things that happen. For instance, this is one of the bedrooms where one of the windows has been pushed, revealing the structure of one of the bridges. This is another one of the bridges that stops right before it touches the cylindrical structure. Next. Now, I want to jump into a different type of, now we're going to very briefly an urban project that we designed for Chicago a couple of years ago. And this talks about the relationship between the drawings I showed before and our practice. And what's interesting is that it's very easy to think about the relationship between writing and reading. That is, a book has been written and we know how to go from that text to reading the text. That it's natural. Now, what's not natural at all is to go from reading to writing. There is always a leap. There is always a break. There is always a discontinuity. And that's what this project in a way talks about. This project deals with an island in Chicago. Very few people know that in the center of Chicago there is an island called Goose Island. And we were asked to produce a master plan, which actually was the last master plan we ever designed, because we always had a certain suspicion about the term master plan, because of a master. And because a master always connotates a slave. And we don't use that anymore. The next plan I'm going to show is called a vision plan, which is an absurd idea anyway. Now, here what you see is a project where the pieces have been put together by cutting, Xeroxing, and gluing. Pieces of our encyclopedia of American cities, for which we've been severely criticized. Now, I usually don't spend too much time defending this because obviously this is a conceptual project, and I feel that in the same way as Ville Contemporain shouldn't be criticized in a sense that is a conceptual project. I think what should be criticized are all the people who took that for real. In this case, what we're talking is about fragments of the city that float in a park, and not just buildings that float in a park. And we feel that as an idea is more interesting, more viable, and I would say if you live in Los Angeles, almost realistic, because if you go to Orange County, that's what that is about. You know, those projects that appear as pieces in the landscape, those neighborhoods, cut out with nothingness around them. Now, obviously, it could be a question for an architect. That is, what do we do with the holes in the city? What do we do with all that space that surrounds the pieces of fabric that are left over because of erosion, because of decay, because of the parking lots, because of a number of reasons? That is what it's now being called negative growth, which is another one of original American inventions. Cities used to just grow, now they shrink. And this project somehow talks about that. And as I'm saying, talks about a different way of reading this, which is with a car, with a certain speed, zigzagging through the through those pieces of fabric. Now, when I'm talking about speed and zigzagging, I'm not just referring to that in the sort of Virilio type sense. Because actually, I think I'm a true believer of slowness. And actually, I was in France a month ago as a respondent to Paul Virilio, who gave his standard thing about the minimum effort, and if you see a staircase and an elevator, you go straight to the elevator, etc. So I basically talked about walking and going up the stairs as aerobics. And an idea that goes definitely beyond the car, because that's what at least we do in New York. That is, you save money just by going up the stairs when you go to your office, instead of going into the club and paying for it and doing 20 minutes of the running machine. So in a way, the house also talks about the re-semantization of elements that perhaps belong to other technologies or other languages. Let's see the next. Now, the Des Moines vision plan. On the left-hand side, the plan of the city of Des Moines. On the right-hand side, the same plan showing the 1 mile grid. The red is the real streets on the 1 mile grid. The gray is the downtown. And as you can see, the 1 mile grid does not penetrate the downtown. And the reason, next slide, is that there is something that does not allow this grid to penetrate. Next, which is this, the old grid, the skewed grid of downtown Des Moines, of the foundation plan. And you can see now this grid in the context of the 2 by 4 mile downtown of Des Moines. The next drawings show the foundation plan, the cutouts that are suggested by the first foundation plan, and the axes that are still traces in the present condition of the Des Moines plan. The next. Next. When we started to look into the plan, we realized that there was only one street that belonged to the two grids, which is this horizontal street that then skews and then goes back to the north-south. This street happens to link two major institutions in Des Moines, the Art Center on the left-hand side and the Fairgrounds, which is perhaps the major institution, the place where they have this country fairs once a year and everybody comes and with the largest pig, the largest tomato, the largest cabbage, etc. Anyway, which is real fun. I mean, I've been going there for the last 4 years, and it sort of opened my eyes to a totally different world. Now, they have the best small collection of paintings opposite that on this small green rectangle. And then the big rectangle on the south is the airport, which is only 5 minutes from downtown Des Moines. Now, what's interesting is that the street, the only street that connects the two grids, links to the street that leads you to the airport, that is linking the three major institutions, the gate to Des Moines and the two cultural institutions, and it intersects this north-south grid exactly at the point where it goes across the Raccoon River. Now, I would say what these drawings show are the basic skeleton of the city. And there is no need to design anything. It's just a question of showing the people in Des Moines what they have. And actually, that's basically what we've been doing. That is, instead of coming to the city as the people who know, as the New York consultants, we came to the city with our drawings. And we asked them to read our drawings or to reread their city through our drawings, through my drawings. Now, an aspect which for me is as important as all the drawings is the way the work is being structured. That is, we don't work for them. They work for us. That is, the planning department, plan and zoning, the major planner of Des Moines works for me. The business community designated a planner who also works for me. The three of us, in a way, work together. We work in a way where I bring drawings, they read them. They give me their readings, and that's the material that then is processed. That is, I'm this black box where information comes in and out and goes into local black boxes and circulates. Now, the project is also being conducted with a group of 90 people, everybody the who and is who in Des Moines, neighborhood associations, union leaders, etc., council people, education people, etc., clergy, CEOs of major companies. I show them the drawings you are going to see. And I guess at the beginning they laughed, then they were a bit amazed, and then they finally entered into this dialogue and somehow entered into architecture. And through the discussion of the architecture of Des Moines is where this project actually has developed. So I think it's very important for you to see this not as a, what I'm showing and what I've been showing as a purely conceptual or architectural exercise, but also as a powerful tool. One of the most interesting aspects of this project is also the way we structured our relationship to the local mass media. That is, we've been working with the newspapers, the advertising agencies, the radio, TV, local stations, etc., and basically worked for them. That is, we drew for the newspaper they would then redraw our drawings for their publication. Let's keep going with these drawings. What you see on the left-hand side is a wedge, the point where the two grids meet, and that's the reason why those streets vacillate, they doubt on the left-hand side. Existing neighborhoods, potential neighborhoods, the two major institutions, the white shape on the right-hand side with the state capitol on the right-hand side of the river. There is a white dot on the other side and two red lines, two avenues that somehow form the shear condition, which talk about the state versus the city. Again, another feature that we just found, another found object in the city of Des Moines. Next. The distortion of grids related to the shape, to the semicircular shape of the river, and then on the right-hand side, some of the topographical accidents which we've seen as constellations in the topography of Des Moines. And what we're talking is about, obviously, the view from the airplane or the sky projected, or the all reading of the sky projected onto the city. The next. And the idea that Des Moines could be also seen as this bestiary. Let's see the next. As this place where the plan is some sort of an ideogram, and that where the plan is also a series of labyrinths where the movement somehow stops, but also a place where there are a number of bugs and other type of dangerous things. Okay, next. Animals that and birds like the hawk that could be domesticated, but I would say only momentarily, and they would go wild any minute. Next. The steer happens to be actually the place where the fairgrounds happens to be, and the buggy is ready to land on it. Next. Now the new reading of the city of Des Moines on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, in blue, all the pieces of the city that didn't go through the sieve of the analysis, which also talks about the fact that the analysis is always incomplete, that it's always limited, and there is always stuff to reread in a different way in the future, hopefully, and hopefully by someone else. So let's keep going. So these are the drawings we discussed with the mayor, with the city council, etc., and that somehow were published as New York consultant sees bestiary in the plan of Des Moines. Like, what's wrong with him? Anyway, this is Des Moines, okay? This is 10 minutes from Des Moines on the right-hand side, and this is their tiny Manhattan. Des Moines happens to be one of the most important insurance centers in the world. It's the third international insurance center: London, Hartford, Des Moines. On the foreground, the state capitol on the east side of the river. Next. The city as it appears from the plane, the city as it appears from a skyscraper. It's basically parking lots. The city is a donut, I would say, with a hole in the center and a little thing in the center of the donut, which is this downtown. Now this whole is 120 acres of parking on ground, plus a number of parking structures. So we came with a number of ideas in relationship to this strange donut. Okay, next. For instance, they talk about their business district and about the west side center of Des Moines. And we said, you don't have a center. You have a linear downtown. You have a corridor, not a center. That's very different. Any architect would know the difference between linear and central. So they said, so what? So we said, you know, that's actually the problem, because the right-hand side is they see as the state, and it's sort of decayed. And the left-hand side is their city, and it's doing okay. And there is a conflict between those two sides, and obviously there are interest for people to revitalize the right-hand side. And we said, you know, if you start to look at your center as your downtown as this bar, then the river is not just that element that splits the bar, but it's also a buckle of a belt that could link those two sides. And obviously what's important is to invent these tacky metaphors in order to give text to these drawings. And obviously one text is the one that I will present here, and a very different text is the one I will present there. Now the black there, that sinister black, talks about a lack, a void. And the void we find is the void of and the lack of people living in downtown. No one lives there. So we said, you know, people used to live there, and why not start to think about the slogan, the flight to downtown? So the newspapers picked up on that and started to publish articles on this new idea. People want to come back to downtown. So let's see what's next. So we started to propose, you see the black becomes yellow, which is a bit more interesting, but then it becomes neighborhoods. The texture is totally different. The rectangle with those big blocks, 300 by 600 feet long blocks, is the only downtown neighborhood alive in existence. It's a landmark neighborhood. All the other ones do not exist. They're either parking lots or warehouses surrounded by parking lots. So as you can see, we're proposing a number of new downtown neighborhoods. We're proposing to change the river. You could see that the river now becomes a lake at the point of entrance. The lake extends, etc. Let's see the next. One of those neighborhoods, obviously those streets are not existent. There are only 3 streets. There are a lot more streets and blocks are smaller. Next. What's interesting is that for every one of these neighborhoods, we presented at least 4, if not 5 or 6 different versions, potential ways of developing them. And the idea is that there is not going to be one. That is, that what we're going to provide is a number of possibilities, a menu of projects for the city to have as a tool for negotiation with developers or with people who are going to actually make these things to happen. So we don't have a project. The project is actually not a linear project because we started to think about implementation, about financing before we even design these projects. So this is an undeterminate, non-linear project. Next. This is the first neighborhood that we developed, which is called Hillside. It's a parking lot with a slope of 100 feet from one side to the other. As you can see on the left-hand side, the thesis for developing this neighborhood is very close to the Chicago project I showed before. On the right-hand side, we're proposing suburban precincts surrounded by perimeter blocks. So they're a strange hybrid of houses and apartment houses or townhouses coexisting in a new type of landscape. Next. The actual project, one of the alternatives for a hillside which is now in the process of development. So on the left-hand side, topographic treatment, alternating bands of grass and hard areas, public spaces on the right-hand side. Next. Since the whole neighborhood is built on top of a new underground garage that makes a new topography, the rectangles on the right-hand side on the light green indicate the overlapping of the public spaces and the underground garages. The dark green indicate the deep soil where trees could be planted. Next. So as you can see, the process started with public spaces and ended up with this, which is one of the final alternatives, where you could see a checkerboard of blocks that present street walls with other blocks that present, let's say, free-form type configurations. Next. A knot, a number 2, etc., an interrogation mark, a question mark. Next. And now very quickly, a number of alternative massing projects for the east side based on the idea of a checkerboard, trying to reuse, to produce a project with a lot of void or a lot of holes. Next. Okay, next. I mean, these are the projects that the building department will have in their position instead of a master plan. The next. A project for their airport, which is basically about landscaping with farmland and framing the existing airport. Next. And different parties for their parking lot in front, which we propose to transform into a park. Next. Okay. Next. Okay, and these are very briefly 3 more slides about a project that Diana Agrest designed last year for San Francisco. And I wanted to show this because I talked about fabric, object, about contemporary city, about the American city, about the European city, etc. But then what about something else that it's neither? The other city. And this is about the city of voids and not of objects, about an artificial ground. And this project happens in San Francisco. The project also proposes a very complex program of different type of activities, scientific, arts and crafts, housing, etc., what you would have called a utopian project, experimental farms, experimental energy, etc. The next slide, pair of slides, which explain the section of the project and the fact that there are a number of different projects overlapped, each of them with a different language, with a different idea. All these courtyards are accessed, as you could see, at a certain level. The grid of the city is still existing on the ground, but then the project proposes this new topography, this new artificial ground. All these circles are actually linked by a mechanism of gears, which is described in this drawing, and you see another drawing, that is everything rotate in an extremely slow way besides the rectilinear movement given by the grids. The next. The gear movement and the view of the project on the right-hand side. The freeway becomes a housing. Next. And the explanation of these drawings would get us into a different lecture, so I'm going to just finish with those 2 drawings. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take questions for about 15 minutes.
And if you have still energy left. What? Feature? Future. You see, I think that what I've been showing is what I would call the permanent elements of the city. That is, the elements that are never erased, or they're very difficult to erase. And I feel that the grid and public space in general belongs to that category. It's like if you ask me, what is the future of the monuments in America? I guess they're going to be there. And I feel that the same is probably true about the grid and about the street system. Actually, suppose we erase them, they'll still be there. Because as you know, science has shown, civilizations that have been buried for thousands of years still show. Satellite photographs still show. So they're there to stay. You see, first of all, the perfect grid exists in the imaginary dimension. That is, what I try to show is that either because of historical reasons or because of, and when I'm saying historical, I'm saying ideological, economic, political, or because of geographic reasons, the grid breaks. So there are always breaks in the grid. And those breaks are always, in a way, points of entrance into the enigma of the city. That is, it's here in Los Angeles is very clear. When I was working with the plan of Los Angeles, I went to this place in downtown where they have the microfilm of the old maps, and it's very clear that the lines, the establishment of the grids relate to the first property subdivision, the large ranches, and the same thing goes for New York, where I had students investigate that. Now, the question of the meaning of those breaks, and I think that what we can do is show that there are some correlations. And the next thing we can do goes beyond this room. That is, we could be political about it. That is, we could do something about it or not. So I would say that does not belong to the realm of architecture. That is, that belongs to the question of us being also political animals. Or Tell me again, you feel that the ideal grid is... It's never politically neutral. No, I agree with you. That is, I would say there is always an ideological, political dimension in it. That is, first of all, I don't know if we can talk about ideal grid. That is, if in the end they are all real grids, or they are at least textual grids. That is, the 1 mile grid belongs to a text. Okay, belongs to Jefferson's deciding that the townships were going to be measured in mile grids, as 6 by 6 mile grids. Some grids came from Spain, that is the law of Indies, and there are usually economic reasons for the grid to be designed the way it's designed. That is, for instance, I would say, even if you could justify certain grids as being designed with the measurement of human scale, that human scale presents obviously a politics, because that human scale is probably a male human scale, adult male human scale, and I would say it's not the scale of a child, or it's not the scale of a 70-year-old. So I would say I would agree with you, there is no way of escaping that. Yep. Yeah, you see, I guess there is, I mean, it's obvious that there is one obsession. Now, when I design, I don't theorize, I design. So for me, that's the answer. That is, somehow it's the same body, the body that draws and that's obsessed about the city, and then the body that also draws a sink. Now, I'm not my own critic. I don't want to criticize my work. I don't want to know how things get translated, if they get translated or not. So I don't have an answer. Okay? For instance, I know that the house I showed came to us because this client, who's an art collector, had seen a project that we had designed for some follies for an exhibition in Leo Castelli Gallery. And he liked those objects, and he said, you know, I would like a house that doesn't look like a house, but more like a collection of things, a collection of buildings, he said, some sort of a village. And I said, okay, great. You know, once I started to see the house as a collection of buildings, it became more interesting, and especially buildings that didn't want to be together, but that kept a distance from each other, and you needed to move in order to go from one building to the next. But then I didn't really think about the city when I designed the house. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think they do, but I basically don't like translations. I don't like translations from the theory to the practice, from the architecture to the urbanism, from this to that. I prefer things that are more fluid, and I want to surprise myself. It's very different What I'm saying is something else. That is, I don't want to be the theoretician of my work. That is, I'm very critical, but I know also about the total lack of distance between me and me. Okay? So, I mean, it's obvious that, our process of design is like coitus interruptus. Okay? It's like we stop all the time and we look at it. Okay, it's like, it's like you never get there because you always look at yourself. So it's a very neurotic type of process. Okay, but on the other hand, I would not write an article explaining. I find that totally appalling when an architect explains his work in theoretical terms. I just find it terrible. So, I mean, I don't mind criticizing other architects theoretically, and I've done that before. Okay. Yep. Right. I would say that that's what we are trying to do in Des Moines. That is the way we sold the idea of this vision plan, which, as I'm saying, as a name is a bit absurd because plan is about one thing and vision is about something else, or perhaps it's not the opposite, which is what we also like, but there are two different things. And was that we told them that our major problem with master plans was the idea that it didn't work with the idea of free market and the Darwinian idea of free market. And that there is a major paradox in the notion of planning in democracy. And basically, this is all about, what we're doing there is all about this market question, which is present at every step of the process. What's interesting is that it forces us to rethink the way you design, the way you bring input into the machine, the black box, but also about how do you produce for that market? Because obviously it's very different when you have a client and a determinate client, or when you have an undeterminate client that is also going to work in a table in a situation of negotiation. So there is where we came up with the idea that what we are basically giving them is a software, let's call it, a menu with options where these people have their program, and basically they can take things, from under the table, put them there, and then switch them and know more or less what the rules of the game are. And the rules might be contradictory. You see, that's what's, in our view, very interesting. That is, all the projects that we're proposing are not just transformations of the same project, but they're theses that oppose sometimes each other. So the final result is totally unknown. You see? So anyway, that's just to give you an example of how that element sort of came into, I would say, the writing of the city, which is the basic question also of the city. Because you see, in a way what we're doing is suppressing time with our reading, because the reading is synchronic. And we're saying, okay, we cut at a certain point and read, and there is no history, in a way. So we are reversing the way historians have looked at the city, okay? Now, instead of doing the instantaneous project, that is, we eliminated time in reading and we're putting time into writing. Let's put it that way. So the Darwinian thing comes now into the project, which I think it's really, we are very excited about it. And that's, in terms of projects, that's our next book. Okay. Okay, I think we exhausted the questions. Okay.
Are equally processes that have been associated, at least since the 1930s, with the phenomenon of life. Again, the phenomenon of life is no longer simply the study of life in organic milieus. What has changed is that geometry has recently become the dominant form of modeling and experimentation regarding problems of self-organization and the autonomous processes of living systems. Again, the lineage here is essentially people like Darcy Thompson, the biologist who was once, the theoretical biologist who was once absolutely standard reading in architecture schools, and up through people, of course, like Waddington and René Thom, the topologist. Now, very recently, a potential breakthrough was made by Stuart Kaufman and others at the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute is this place where, essentially, I would say it's where the Santa Cruz chaologists essentially moved, I suppose, sometime in the 1980s. In any case, they're sponsoring some extraordinary research there now, and this fellow Stuart Kaufman has recently published, I think only as recently as 4 or 5 months ago, this extremely important paper. The breakthrough concerns a kind of newly discovered specific critical point in geometrical organization. Could I have the next slide, please? Just flick both of them. Great, thank you. Now, in Kaufman's experiment, standard Boolean networks were set up like the two you are looking at here in the diagram on the screen. Just want to make sure that they're upright. Yeah. Now, a Boolean network, try to follow this. It's really, really very simple. Don't get math anxiety here, because it won't be any fun if you don't follow it. It's really very, very easy. It's essentially, a Boolean network is a network of linked elements between which, very simply, information is passed in a very rudimentary way. Each element, for example, the elements I'm talking about here are the disks, the black and white disks. Each element may be in an on or off state, here, black or white. And every element to which it is linked will therefore know what state the first element is in. Each unit switches itself on or off based on what it learns about the states of those elements connected directly to it. The rules for how an element is supposed to act in relation to what inputs, they're arbitrary and they're absolutely of no interest to you, so you just forget about it, don't worry about it. Simply that there are certain rules and that these rules are established at the outset. All one does is wire up the elements, establish the rules, turn the system on, and watch it go. Now, in brief, and I'm afraid to truncate and simplify the findings of this experiment, but what the Santa Fe experiment showed was that for a wide range of dial settings, or a wide range of instructions, let's say, the system's initially random behavior, let's say the system begins sort of randomly and it percolates all over the place, the system's initially random behavior would soon become highly ordered, that is, locked into a state where most of the elements stopped undergoing any further change at all. Now, that's what you see here basically in the left diagram. The elements in the blue regions are essentially locked or frozen and are no longer capable of any activity, while the red regions, the elements in the little islands of red, they represent, again, islands of activity that will continue fluctuating forever. Now, the idea is once a system has settled into a state like this, you can go in there and you can muck about as much as you want with the elements. The point is that they will basically always return, all of the elements in the blue area, they'll return to this state, to the state that they're actually in, as you see them here, whereas you can create some kind of little islands of life in the red areas, but they're absolutely incapable of communicating themselves, if you like, through the system. So what you essentially have here, in those classic terms, is a failure to communicate. Nothing that happens inside of any one of the red areas will ever be able to achieve any kind of collective, let's say, behavior or structure with any of the other areas. Now, what they found, and what was interesting, is that above a certain critical point on the dial, the system will actually manifest behavior of a very different kind. It now will remain in wild, chaotic flux, developing only very few isolated frozen regions. That's what you see there on the right side. So there you see, in fact, what you have now is a couple of islands of frozen activity, essentially in a sea of wildly, well, not even wildly, but nonetheless loosely percolating flux. In the first case, which is on your left, random mutations or perturbations introduced into the system will be immediately contained and damped right out of the system into oblivion, leaving no effect. In the second case, they often produce avalanches of what is called damage. That's to say, you go in there and you switch, you fiddle with some of those disks, and what will happen is it'll set off chain reactions throughout the entire system, which is called avalanches, and it's known as damage in Boolean network theory. It will affect and alter the activity of nearly every unfrozen element in the system. Now, what we have here is not quite what we had in Waddington's diagrams, because what we have here is a totally dead and frozen state, absolutely incapable of communicating its differences, if you like, through itself. On the other side, we have something that's much too wild to ever actually take on life in any kind of environment. But they came up with another idea. The next step was to relate the behavior patterns of these two networks to the classical states of matter. And let's just say there are three classical states of matter, even though I know these are being problematized, essentially solid, liquid, and vapor or gas. According to the model developed by Christopher Langton, one of the gurus of artificial life, they characterized the first highly ordered system, the one on your left, as a solid, a system where molecules, for example, tend to line up in fixed patterns. And the second system, the maximally disordered system that you see on your right, as a gas. That's to say, where molecules move around absolutely randomly. Networks in an unstable intermediate state were then hypothetically referred to as liquid. Here they're actually treating liquid as a kind of a transition state or as an intermediate state of matter. And the intermediate states are essentially what the study of life is all about, and what, in fact, all the phenomena of self-organization have recently become obsessed with. The idea then was to carefully lower one parameter to draw the system very close to, but not across, the critical value of the phase transition from solid to gas, in order only slightly to melt, actually to melt some, but only some of the frozen elements. It was at this very precarious point of liquefaction, this point at the very edge of chaos, that suddenly a new range of interesting behaviors emerged. What is important is that what emerged was not a single type, but indeed a variety and a balance of behaviors. So what we have now is already this process of scaling. A balance of behaviors, both small and large avalanches, took place in response to changes or pressures introduced from without, demonstrating a remarkably broad spectrum of reactivity to environmental perturbation. What's very important is that let's say we're talking here about organisms, it's very important that it be able to resist massive damage, let's say, massive transformation to its genotype or to its phenotype, and yet at the same time, in order to be truly an adaptable organism, it has to be capable of actually undergoing at the right moment, when it's absolutely necessary, a rather total or fundamental transformation and still surviving. So what you absolutely have to have is extremely sensitive parameters enabling a minimum of massive damage, but still allowing for the possibility of that type of change. Communicability and sensitivity, but also robustness and processes of dynamic self-regulation were manifested. That's to say, they actually came up with this network that began almost to percolate in front of their eyes as if it were a living animal. Manifesting behavior identical, in fact, to that demonstrated in the evolutionary and developmental processes modeled in Waddington's diagrams. The Boolean network experiment shows, and it's crucial, in fact, because it shows that the complexity of a system peaks at its liquid transition point. In other words, at its softest state. There would indeed seem to be much to celebrate in the advent of this new, flexible, complex, soft approach to the processes of nature and form, the supplanting of an old and partly moribund mathematical rationality and ethos, whose rigidity has finally brought it to the point of diminishing returns. And I'm referring there, of course, to the classical scientific mechanistic or atomist tradition. But we must not jump too uncritically onto the suppleness bandwagon. For if these new models, these new intellectual models, are arising today with such extraordinary force and rapidity in our philosophical and scientific milieus, it is at least partly because the details of our material existence are undergoing on many strata a similar epochal transformation from a solid to a liquid state. What I would like to do now in the last section of the paper is begin to detail, but rather schematically, the problem, the way this phase transition is beginning to affect our technological and material milieus, and why, in fact, we're at a very crucial moment historically. The types of material transformation I'm talking about belong to two only apparently distinct categories or domains of technological organization. The first has to do with the large-scale or macroscopic integration of machines of all different types, scales, and distances apart. The second type of transformation deals with the microscopic penetration into and exploitation of the fine structure of matter. Well, one of the fundamental innovations that is taking place today is of course the discovery of the richness of intermediate states, the newly discovered capacity that matter can actually compute, and that in fact it's this computing process, with this thing that I called at the beginning of the paper, a dynamics of information, was in fact not only the source of life and self-organization and difference in the universe, but that in fact it is finally something. And I don't mean this necessarily in any kind of great cheerleader way, but it is finally something that can be tapped, and it is being tapped. In the first category, I'm referring to the complex, electronic, and for the most part digital infrastructural systems that on a global scale will link together a wide variety of machines and machinic clusters in the same way that telephones are connected today. I want to insist on the telephone as a certain type of paradigm, if you like, of technological innovation and, let's say, even social geometrical organization, because it is fully organismic, if you like, in its functioning, entirely different from the way it was, from the original configurations through which it was introduced into our culture, which was essentially a broadcast technology to broadcast concerts in Central Europe to people's houses. Now, this will certainly, almost certainly, entail the digitalization. I mean, the telephone does remain today, without question, the paradigmatic technology for the transformations I'm talking about. This will almost certainly entail the digitalization of existing analog technologies, such as television and telephone, permitting the in-depth, and I really insist on this in-depth, I'll try to explain what that in-depth means, the in-depth integration of sound, text, image, and raw data technologies, as well as their large-scale transmissional infrastructure, and this both from the software and hardware points of view. The hardware problem here is essentially one of this, whether, for example, America wants to spend the $300 billion to entirely rewire the country with fiber optic cable, which is essentially what one will need in order to actually implement this total integration of wide bandwidth, or of, in fact, various bandwidth technologies within a single environment. The idea here simply is that there will no longer be a telephone cable distinct from a telephone wire distinct from a television cable, for example, but that all of these, there will be a single cable carrying all information of every kind and all communications into the household, which will be, of course, met by a multimedia station or something worse, like a VR station. But secondly, and of equally great importance, will be the relentless VR, virtual reality. Of equally great importance will be the relentless phenomenological integration of the human nervous system. For these machines and machinic clusters or complexes will penetrate and occupy not simply our material, sort of concrete worlds, but in fact our attention worlds, as much as possible qualitatively. That is, as integrated environments rather than as distinct objects per se. This is partly because materially they present themselves literally as fluid, multidimensional, polyphonic sensoriums. Just think of the levels, for example, of information imparted while watching a 40s thriller on television, or during an even random telephone conversation with a friend or relative. But also, partly because we will interact with these machines, these complexes, these software sensoriums, of course I mean multimedia and virtual reality, through seamless natural interfaces. That is, we will interact directly through voice, gesture, touch, and ultimately in entirely unconscious ways. The first point, of course, is that everybody knows, or everyone ought to know, that what is disappearing today, and it's a rather momentous disappearance, is the keyboard, for example, the interface between the machine and the still, let's say, human organism outside of the machine. The other thing I want to point out is that the reason I chose those examples of the 40s thriller on television and the telephone conversation, say with one's mother, is simply because to illustrate the differences between what many technocrats and technologists consider to be a theory of information, and the differences between what they call wide and narrow bandwidth transmissions. The point being that clearly watching a 40s thriller, only one level, for example, of the imparted information actually concerns the intuition and the reception of the actual plot, what actually happens, the actual details that push the narrative ahead. Clearly, one also watches oneself watching a 40s thriller. One notices, for example, the clothing, the differences in posture, the jargon. the furniture, the music, for example. I mean, there is all of that kind of rich, but not sufficiently, let's say, theorized or concretized aspects of a wide bandwidth system, which is something that we're finally, of course, being robbed of in many ways with these new information technologies. And of course, talking to one's mother, it matters not what one says, but the hideous and annoying silences which can last, a nanosecond too long, but which of course create the, that flow of information. Now finally, this soft environmental penetration of our attention worlds by technology will be affected still more deeply through the progressive saturation of even our concrete milieus by the microchip. So much of our material environment that was once inert or simply mechanical will become computerized, digitized, servo-controlled, real-time responsive, and above all, interlinked. But here, in discussing software and microchip-driven milieus, one is already closing in on the second category of technical innovation and material organization, namely on the microscopic domain, on those processes that are elaborated at the level of the fine structure of matter. And here we're talking about the whole problem of states. But also, states, what we have discovered or what is being discovered today in the West, because it's certainly something that has not been lost on many other cultures, is that essentially behavior and properties are what determine, let's say, the essence of things, and that these are properties of their capacities of transformation, or in a more scientific form, the flow of matter is where these types of characteristics, or what are known as emergent properties, that's essentially where they arise. At the purely engineering level, let us leave to the side for now the theoretical scientific dimension of these developments. At the purely engineering level, we seem embarked today into a world where materials themselves are becoming active and no longer merely passive shapers of our dynamical environment. This applies at the literal mechanical level with the emergence of programmable materials such as shape memory alloys and smart metals. I suppose the most dramatic example of the great smart metal revolution, though of course it hasn't fully happened yet, but nonetheless was Terminator 2, where we saw the mechanical beast of Terminator 1 return as a kind of fluid, self-organizing liquid, or a liquid object. I also want to insist on something that's very important. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it properly here right now, but there is no fundamental difference between the emergence of something like a real smart metal in the real world, that's to say something that actually does have those properties, and the software that would design it, or the software that would simulate, or rather, I don't mean simulate at all, I mean model it. Now, it should be understood that the Alias software that was used to make that movie was in fact faked it, okay? They were not continuous algorithms. It was not a real computation, formal transformation, topological, mapping computation. The fact is that they will emerge together, that the algorithms are absolutely independent of substrate, whether it happens in a computer or whether they actually master it, if you like, in the metallurgical laboratories, there's absolutely no difference. It's really a problem of organization. And for that reason alone, it's clear that these, but not to mention the fact that they are already beginning to emerge. There are, let's say, we wouldn't call them smart metals, but what we have today are sort of charming metals. Now, the emergence, for example, of glasses, ceramics, and polymers that change structure, these are also sort of these charming materials, they change their structure, that is to say their shape, their color, their opacity, with variation in electric current, pressure, or temperature, classic piezoelectrics, for example. New techniques such as the integration of organic molecules and, of course, piezoelectric crystals or piezoelectric elements into the deep structure of matter, rendering it sensitive and increasingly responsive and cross-referenced with random fluctuations in its immediate environment. Though the study of molecular structure and morphology goes back at least 60 years, and I believe it was Linus Pauling really who initiated this this type of study. What is decisive today is the technical capacity for intervening actively within these structures, to manipulate and even to engineer them. Work in the burgeoning fields, for example, of superconductivity, again a morphological problem of ceramic layers and strata, especially the distribution of irregularities throughout a system and the optimization of those irregularities to create effects which nobody can explain, but they know are somehow a property of the structure of the matter. Liquid crystals, again, liquid crystals, one of the classic and very important intermediate states of matter which are being exploited today. And the very important thing, of course, is that the form and the state are now becoming coupled to one another. Aerogels, which in fact are not active materials, but they're fun because they're so beautiful in translation. They're sometimes called solid smoke, sometimes gossamer solids, but they have rather extraordinary properties, which in fact, the most recent one is that they are the most insulating material at this point, I think, known. The recent infatuation with buckyballs, we all read about Buckminster fullerene, that synthetic carbon supermolecule. The important point is that it's an entirely synthesized molecule. It's regular, it's ugly in a certain kind of way, but it has spectacular properties in different configurations, including frictionlessness and other things. There's the notorious Utah cold fusion experiments, which I really insist on bringing these up, if only because it was so shabbily treated by the press. And today, the cold fusion experiments are not only being reported again by the most prestigious scientific journals, but there are laboratories all over the world which are reporting results similar to Ponce and Fleischmann. Though we know it's not cold fusion, it's clear that something new, another state, another intermediate state with a whole series of properties is beginning to emerge. I don't even know how many properties there are of water, but clearly I think we're up to 7, 8, 9 states. Eric Drexler's widely hyped speculations on experimental engineering and in infinitesimal, or what he calls nanotechnologies, these tiny molecular robots that one just sort of eats or has injected inside of one, but which do these things precisely. They tap this computing capacity, this active capacity of molecules and microstructures. These are but a few examples that unquestionably signal the emergence of a new frontier of matter. Very soon, newer and far more astonishing developments will certainly emerge. I'm going to skip this section. It really has to do with the scanning tunneling microscope, the scanning tunneling electron microscope, which can actually just get in there and pick up every little nook and cranny of any molecular surface. What is fun about it, I'll just mention this, is some of you may have seen the IBM logo, which is the first atomistic, the first logo, if you like, to actually been imprinted on a molecule. They actually dropped atoms in one by one and patterned the IBM logo into a molecule, and then of course photographed it, and then of course transmitted the photograph to every press agency in the world. Okay, now I'm going to skip this a little bit here. These purely engineering developments capable of exploiting, important now, the behavioral properties and organizational capacities, the so-called singularities of matter, that is, their fluid dynamics, okay? All of the properties that emerge around their various liquid and liquefying states and pre-liquid states, which until now lay unreachably embedded within its finest or within its deepest fine structure, will be coupled at the phenomenological scale to an intensified deployment, as well, one hopes, as an appreciation and cultivation of the enormous intellectual and sensual presence of materials and their specific properties. This is obviously something that one knows about when one studies any of the Japanese craft disciplines. The important point here really is that the role of current technologies is increasingly to try to cycle up, if you like, these molecular level, these singularities, let's say, or properties that emerge from liquid, well, these emergent features that emerge from the liquid states, and to cycle them up to the phenomenological level where they're actually experienced. Now, it's not simply that we're going to be living this lovely kind of fluid world. The problem is much more complex because they have discovered, in some ways, the specific capacity of life, which is essentially that it is that there are these overtone structures, I will talk about it in a minute, which are produced on the interaction of very simple elementary systems in interaction produce extremely complex and, because nonlinear, indeterminate behavior at a larger scale. Now, we shall clearly no longer be dealing purely with spatial qualities, at least not simply spatial qualities the way we once were. For of increasing importance now will be the fluid capacities of interconnected and interacting material systems. Their new capacity spontaneously to move and to change, to correlate themselves to other external movements and changes, to embrace some bandwidth of the aleatory, and in response to it, to undergo transformation in time. With this double movement in technological development toward both global and molecular systems of integration, a type of world emerges whose material, technical, and architectural articulations, no longer simply objects, structures, or buildings, but indeed electromaterial environments at all scales, manifest themselves in a soft, perhaps insidiously holographic manner, a world where everything flows seamlessly together in real time. The complex interpenetration and integration of technical, architectural, biological, and social structures into a single multi-level fluid suggests that only a properly cybernetic or ecological model will be adequate either for its analysis or for effective intervention within it. Our technical culture and material world are now following older but fundamental economic processes toward a potentially catastrophic phase shift to liquid or near liquid geometries that are already beginning to take on a life of their own. One need only cite, for example, the 1987 stock market crash and the feedback loops between various computers and software systems that actually accelerated and galloped away, if you like, with the market that day. And the necessity, of course, for building controls on the systems, which, of course, at another level, one will easily argue, all that really does is cripple or fetter them. With respects to their designed, let's say, productive capacities. What this means at this level of collective and social technologies is that these soft systems are actually capable of manifesting as emergent properties, effects of autonomous subjectivity. A type of subjectivity, in fact, that is distinct from and over and above those limited cognitive ones that they were locally programmed to achieve. Indeed, one of the defining characteristics of our culture may be said to be its general tendency, and they may not say this for many decades, and they may look back on what happened and say this is what they did. Its general tendency to transfer subjectivity to external networks. Now, I believe whether we want to or not, this is simply this is a process of I don't even know if one can use the word natural, but this is an inexorable aspect of self-organizing processes, that once we have assembled this type of network that we're doing now, there will without question be let's say ghosts beginning to develop at higher level strata within the system. This forced mutation within a complex system, I'm talking about, our civilization, within a complex system till now regulated by many millenniums of natural evolution, will have effects that no theorist could yet possibly begin to imagine. And there is absolutely no reason to assume, based on current theoretical understanding, that the so-called life forms that will emerge from this apparatus will see us as anything more than unwelcome perturbations to be damped right out of the system in a single generation. Thank you. Sorry, I don't know. Does anyone have any questions? I've just discovered my pointer, so I can. I'll confess to you, I don't really like answering questions, and I'll answer. Well, okay. Anne? Okay, let me first ask you, when you ask if there's anything, you mean in naturally occurring, purely linear? Well, first let me begin this way by saying that books written in 1987 said that now that we've discovered nonlinearity, it seems that nonlinearity makes up the majority of natural systems. By the time 1989 started rolling around, they started saying nearly all systems are nonlinear, and that linear systems are actually extreme exceptions. In works written in 1990, this is amazing, they are now basically saying that linear systems are unimaginably rare. Unimaginably rare. That they were in fact made so through the models of essential mechanistic modeling. I mean, the need, for example, to understand acceleration meant, of course, doing something with the friction problem. Now, you ask, at the same time, whether one can begin to talk about a purely nonlinear world, and whether it's even interesting to do so. I think that mentally, it's unhygienic. Yes, in classic scientific, like in differential equations. Differential equations are solvable differential equations are purely linear. Whether solvable linear equations have a real correlate in the world is something nobody really knows. But your question is more interesting because it could be seen philosophically. In which case, I think that it's very important to understand that a really complex system is made up, of course, of such a diverse number of periodicities and qualities, if you like, of systems coursing through it, that it is no longer really so important nor possible to fully characterize individually the systems, but really an attempt, and this can only be done really through intuition or increasingly subtle but inexact, to use a word that I think comes from Husserl, but non-exact methods of sort of going with the flow. The idea is to watch behavior patterns and to begin, there are some people who, it seems, for example, who can intuit the movements of the stock markets, people who've been around it for 30 or 40 years. There are some people who seem to have a far better than random luck at predicting movements of stock markets. What can one say? It's not testable. It's one of the great aspects of nonlinearity, not testable. You mean linear systems in life? mean, no, only in the ways it was modeled. By the way, I am not an expert. I read the textbooks, but it's slow going, and I got about 2,000 more pages to go. Yes, I see a hand there. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is, of course, what is being hailed now as the great revolution in computers, is the ability to begin modeling these types of things. If you're asking me, if you actually build the hardware, are you talking about actually building massive distributed parallel networks that will actually self-organize? Absolutely, it's happening every month. One thing I will say is that the AI, the artificial intelligence pathway to the goal is, in my humble opinion, completely off, and it's the artificial life pathway which will get there first. AI is really still using the mimetic model of trying to build a machine that thinks like the brain, whereas A-life is really interested in understanding the processes by, and they will just model it. They'll set it up in either in a computer, which everybody realizes now the computer is this thing that essentially can be programmed to imitate matter. And it's essentially that problem that has, I think, characterized a revolution to come in the 90s, which is just really started to happen. I mean, it came out of chaos science, but it took them years to understand what the heck it was that their computers were doing. And now they've understood what the computer can really do well. It can't think on its own, but it can function as a first order system. It can begin to self-organize, but it has to be introduced at the level of an elemental unit, let's say, like in a Boolean network. Yes, Aaron, after that beautiful introduction. Listen, let me say this. I think you ask the million-dollar question, but I think you've made the mistake. You should not ask it now. You should not ask me. There are a lot of reasons why I say that. To begin with, there are many ways of beginning. But this is truly, I mean, it's a pioneer. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it could come down to saying basically a building has to stand up, and enough of your liquid geometries, because that'll just bring the building down on our heads. Pardon? Well, let me just say this. I think the question may be badly posed as well. It may be a million-dollar question, but million-dollar questions usually remain unanswered. Why? Because the questions, they lose their own milieu, for example, where they make sense. History goes on, and people don't ask that type of question anymore. I think that's certain to happen, and it's already happening. The question is, what type of questions should we be asking? And I feel that in my own work, in the studios that I teach, one of the things I do try to do is I try to shift. I think one thing is certain, is that if the intermediate state is where it all happens, it's probably interesting to try to understand where the emergent properties or the interesting behaviors, for example, in our material environments are taking place. And are they, in fact, natives of the classical levels where we have taught or learned composition? Is the building, is the city as such the domain in which the really interesting processes are taking place, or are they beginning to happen at some other level? History has taught us that that's essentially the way historical processes change. They change in nature. They go through phase shifts where there are fundamental transformations. So I would have to say that the question is not necessarily, even though I happen to be a great believer, I'm a formalist, as you can hear. I don't know if any of you can hear that, but essentially I am, despite myself. I am very interested in morphology, and I do believe that even like in the great cathedrals, the way in which they manifested the classical relationships of harmonic proportions in music, for example, and the way that in some fundamental way that organizes a world for a passerby. I believe that there are apprehensibly shapes and forms and relationships which we see, and I frankly would have to say that we see them in very often in non-Western cultures and in nature. One finds them in writings, fantastic writings like in Goethe and Coleridge. I think one has to see differently and ask new questions, and the environment will change on its own. And of course, we have to keep up to what's going on too. I mean, absolutely. Now, there's no question about it. I agree with everything you just said. We could not have gotten here without soft systems. That's for sure. The argument really is that something is changing today, and that is that the soft system itself, or the dynamo, the soft dynamo, is switching levels. And I think that's very important to track it and to stay with it. Because, I also have an optimistic version of this lecture, a little Buddhist kind of tirade. But I think it's very important to track it and stay with it right now, because it can go either way. And what is certain is that there is so little. All of these people, they vote Democrat, they're nice people, the scientists, but they're cheerleaders. They're cheerleaders, they truly are. They're so interested in their material, but they don't think, what are the social consequences? What are the consequences to civilization? What are the deprivals that these things bring along with them? It's up to architects, the kind of commandos, the intellectual commandos, one would hope, of the material and geometrical world, to engage, just to engage. Or what did they say? What did they say in Vietnam? Contact. Yeah, right. They had to make contact with the enemy. That's really all I can advocate today. Whoa. Yes, intentionally.
Okay. Well, listen, I have great sympathy with why you would leave it out, but nevertheless, at the last moment, now you say that the architects are commandos, the designers of the...
Oh, could be.
But I thought that part of your argument was about the independence of information of some of these phenomena, and that the liquid metal, whether it happened in the computer or in the metal shop, didn't matter. In which case, the distinction that you either are or aren't making, I'm not really sure, between, let's say, the philosophical collection and speculative invention and their material invention, is that a real distinction? And if real
In a way, this belongs to another history, which in a way is the real history of the 20th century, which is the history of the abstract machine. And that is not necessarily a Deleuzian concept. It was one that was used by, it's one that is still current, I would say, in certain theoretical mathematical milieus. But essentially what it means is this, is that for the first time in the 20th century, it became possible to abstract or to express in an algorithm what it is that a machine did. You find it in Gödel, you find it in Turing, that was essentially the idea, that a machine, in fact, could be a set of numbers and a relationship between them. The point, really, that I'm making here is that that the distinction between the theoretical and it's no longer interesting to talk about theory and practice as separate. What is interesting is to understand the relationship between abstract and concrete. It's also important to understand that there are different regimes where the abstract and the concrete take up different places and establish, let's say, a different relationship to one another. The fact is we're moving into one now where it's no longer a significant distinction, that the techniques of knowing and doing and making are inseparable. Now, what does this mean? It means that, in a certain sense, each one becomes invisible to the actor who is in some ways doing the other. Now, it's a problematic world. Now, what does that mean? It probably means a whole profusion of different types of practices that we know nothing about, we can only speculate upon. Now, the thing is this, is that how often have we been self-conscious enough to watch our culture transform? It's clearly a modernist kind of, you could say fetish, but at the same time, if one were to de-pathologize it, I think we would probably, maybe beautifully, overcome our modernness and our Westernness, and there might be something out there for us that, I don't mean to continue the stupid, I don't know what the hell I'm saying to you right now, but I think that, I don't mean to be messianic, I merely mean that it's clear that at least one can define theoretically a transformation which is huge, like equivalent but reverse of, let's say, the introduction of the clock in the 13th century, in the 14th century, or double entry bookkeeping, or perspectival method. I think it's possible to talk in those terms about a transformation occurring today, and to tremble. I don't know what else to do at this point. No. Did you say a model or? I actually couldn't say. I couldn't have said it better than you. Both, perhaps, simultaneously. I think there's hope. I think as technology comes to mimic, and our material world comes, in fact, to mimic the once invisible but fundamental processes of nature, I think there's a window that opens up for us. I think obviously ecological models, green politics, I mean there's all kinds of things. And all of those things will be part of the mixture of historical struggle. You know, I frankly, you know, this is a problem. I frankly want to be optimistic and pessimistic simultaneously, equally. All right, wait, one more question. David Lindbergh. You're not human, David. That's why. Thank you very much.